Hello everyone. In this video I want to talk about color temperature, meaning how warm or how cool a certain pigment is. Warm colors would be yellows, orange, red, and our cool colors would be blues, purples, grays. And the reason I'm using this subject is that I have a photo reference of a dog that passed away a number of years ago. And even though the reference has some really good composition, has some interesting shapes in the back, it's a little bit dull in color and temperature. It was taken on a rainy day, so the light wasn't the strongest. So I'm gonna kind of exaggerate the temperature a little bit to make the painting a bit more interesting. Now, the palette I'm gonna be using is ultramarine blue and radiant turquoise for my cools, burnt sienna and cadmium orange for my warm, and white. So I have a dark and a light cool and a dark and a light uh, warm color, and I won't be using any black for this. So let's get started. I start off by massing in uh, my abstract concept. In other words, how does that mass of the dog fit in on the panel? I'm using burnt sienna and ultramarine blue for the first layer of the painting. The reason I'm using those two pigments is that they're semi-translucent, so they're a little bit weaker than the opaque colors, and it's easier for me to cover that first layer up um, without having the colors blend too much if the original pigment is a little bit on the weaker side. I'm also working really thin in the beginning. I, for the most part, do 90% of my work in alla prima, so I try to finish the painting in one sitting. Um, the overall idea is that I wanted to have a very warm mass in the middle, being the dog, surrounded by a cool atmosphere. So after I masked in my most basic shapes, I start looking for the shapes within the shapes. So as soon as I masked in the abstract concept of the dog, I started looking for the dark areas of the muzzles, the eyes, the ears. I'm mixing in ultramarine blue to that burnt sienna to get some of those shadow colors. Even though the dog is predominantly warm, I want to have some of the cool colors from the background inside the shadow of the dog. I'm going to do something very similar to the background. I'm going to have some of those warmer colors that I find on the dog's fur in that cool background so that the subject matter and the background have some kind of a color relationship and they're working together. Okay. Now I made a conscious choice to have the portrait of the dog, the head of the dog, be the moment of focus. So you'll notice that while I'm painting, I spend a good amount of time on the actual face, but I jump around. I go from the face to the chest, the face to the background, and always coming back. I don't want to hyper focus on just the face because I want to see what the area around the moment of focus, how that influences the portrait. Everything needs to work together. Now, since I'm working from a photo reference, it brings a number of challenges. There's some advantages, but it does bring some challenges. Photography, where some photos tend to distort the proportions. So I made a decision to make the dog's legs a little bit longer and his head a bit smaller. When I was looking at the photo reference, it felt distorted to me, almost like there was a lot of foreshortening going on in the angle that the picture was taken. I wanted to make him look a little bit more elegant, so I changed up the proportions ever so slightly. Um, in the areas of the highlights, that isn't pure white. I'm using a little bit of radiant turquoise mixed in with burnt sienna and a lot of white, and that's what I'm using to make the highlights on the nose and on the muzzle. The only area where I use pure white is in the lightest moment of the painting, and that'll be on the ring of the collar. You'll see it in a minute or two. Everything else in this painting has some kind of a pigment mixed into it, including the light parts of the background have other a warm or a cool pigment mixed into it. By working with a limited palette, I essentially simplify my decision making process. I'm thinking about how warm or how cool a certain area is, or how light or dark an area is. So I'm not having the complication of deciding if I need to use one of the 19 colors that I have on my palette. By having 5 colors, I really simplify this process. Another thing that I'm being conscious of is my brush mark making. Since I'm working from a photograph, I don't want my painting to look like a photograph. I want it to be more interesting than a photograph. So in some areas I'm using a broad brush and leaving the brush marks as they are, not smoothing them out, so that the painting looks very fresh, wet, and painterly. Depending on what the surface is, I'll go with I'll decide what direction I'm gonna make my brush mark in. In other words, in the areas of the floor where the dog is standing, I'll be using some horizontal brush marks. Whereas where the railing is, I'm using much more vertical brush marks. Around the face and neck, I'm using a lot of verticals with a couple of horizontals. But in the body, in the legs, the chest, I'm using a lot of vertical brush marks. It's one of those things that you just kind of have to feel out, I think, and decide aesthetically what's pleasing to you. Now, if you notice in the areas between the railings, I have a gray that I mixed in a good amount of burnt sienna with it, so it's a lot warmer in temperature, whereas the floorboards have a lot more blue and they're a lot cooler in temperature. They're both grays, it's just that the temperature is different. Even the values might be similar, but they won't read the same because the temperature is different. I sprinkled a little bit of that burnt sienna and cadmium orange also in the sky and in the background to make him feel like he's glowing a little bit. And that's just something I do to make him pop a bit more. Well, this painting took me about 2 hours, so it was a nice exercise. A nice little warm-up of the painting that I would use to get me ready for another bigger painting. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please make sure to write on the comments below. Thank you.